With my recent review of the Wharfedale Aura 2 and the MoFi Source Point 8, there's been a lot of requests for me to do some comparisons between different speakers. So the four speakers that I'm going to be talking about today are probably all some of my favorite speakers. They're all within the ballpark of about $1,500 to $2,700, just depending on where you get it, when you get it, etc. But I want to state some things up front before we dive into this. This will be data intensive. So for those of you who are new to this channel, here's my shtick. I provide reviews with objective data as my accountability tool because anybody can just make up anything. So what I try to do is I tell you, hey, this is what I heard. And now let's look at the data and see if we can make sense of it. That also helps you to make better comparisons because let's say that I like a speaker that is more neutral. And then for whatever reason, you tend to find that you like a speaker that has a high frequency bump. Well, you can use this information for your own advantage. What I really want to do here is hit the highlights. And unfortunately, if I were trying to go into the minutia, which sometimes may be required if you really want to talk about the very fine details and differences of speakers, that would require a video that's just way too long. And I think I would lose half of you, if not more, in that process. So I'm going to try to keep things at kind of a high level. And I'm going to do that by giving you first some subjective thoughts up front. And then we're going to get into the details of the measurements. But again, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time. If you're interested in the details, then please see the individual reviews. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do is give you a better idea of a couple speakers that you might like. And then maybe you settle on two, you order both of them, and then you send back the ones that you don't want. Because really, at the end of the day, there's no substitution for actually hearing the speaker. I mean, I can look at a set of data, get a good idea of what I'm going to think of the speaker, but I still want to hear it. And with that in mind, if you choose to order any of these speakers that I'm talking about today, if you don't mind, it would be a big help. Please use my affiliate link in the description below. It doesn't cost you a dime extra, but it does help me. And it's just a nice way of helping support my channel. The first thing I'm going to show you is a comparison of sizes. Left in gold is the Source Point 8. Blue is the KEF R3 Meta. Green is the Wharfedale Aura 2. Red is the Wharfedale Linton Heritage. And you can see that the two Wharfedale speakers are pretty similar in size. The KEF is certainly the smaller one. And then the MoFi Source Point 8 is kind of in between those. Also pay attention to the colors because I'm going to try to keep the color codes the same for all the graphics that you're going to see. And then here's just a front panel shot. It may not be perfect, but it should be roughly in scale. Quick breakdown, the MoFi Source Point 8 and the KEF are both coaxial speakers. The MoFi is a two-way coaxial speaker. The KEF has an additional mid-bass driver. The Wharfedale speakers are both three-way, but they are a little bit different where the Wharfedale Aura 2 uses an AMT tweeter. Let's talk about those coaxials for a second. Generally speaking, and this is true for these speakers, coaxial speakers have a more consistent radiation pattern from the mid-band to the high frequency. And generally speaking, that is both horizontally and vertically, which means that seat-to-seat placement, like let's say you're entertaining or you have a large family or you have a group of friends that come over pretty regularly and you want them to all share in the same sound, give or take, that you hear in the primary seated position. A coaxial speaker will usually benefit you in having that. Vertically, you can walk around, you can listen to music, and you can entertain friends and guests. So that's where the coaxials are going to really shine in that regard. So if that's important for you, a coaxial might be the way that you want to go. Compared to these Wharfedale three-ways that I'm talking about with the separate mid-bass, mid-range, and tweeter, the radiation horizontally is pretty good on them, but they start to narrow up in the higher frequencies. You're going to see some of that data. Vertically, though, is the real key aspect. You can't go more than about 20, maybe 30 degrees from that tweeter line before the mid-range and the high frequency start to fall off pretty significantly. And you're going to get a very, very, very different sound if you're standing up above the speaker or if you're walking around the room with the standard three-way design over coaxial. I'll also mention now that the coaxial speakers generally benefit from towing out. So don't point the speakers directly at you. Tow them out a little bit. Usually 10 to 20 degrees is ideal. The flip side of the coaxials having good directivity is that they may not be as wide in radiation horizontally. So I talked about vertically. If you're standing up, you're walking around, it's not going to sound the same for a three-way design with a separate tweeter. Generally the case. With the coaxials, it's going to sound pretty even no matter where you are in the room. But there is a limit to that radiation width, especially horizontally. If you are sitting more than about 50 degrees or so off the main tweeter line, then the sound is going to start dropping more and more as you get further and further to the side with the coaxial design like the MoFi or the KEF. With the Wharfedale speakers, they have broader radiation in the mid-range, upper mid-range area, but then they start to narrow up. And again, we're going to see some evidence for that, but I'm putting that out there right now so you have an idea of what's coming. The MoFi, the KEF, the Wharfedale Aura 2, and the Wharfedale Linton 85 all have really good linearity. They're all within plus or minus 3 decibels, and maybe even better than that for some of them. So it's not really a concern when you're talking about how accurate are they. They're pretty accurate, but each of them has a little bit of a flavor that is going to be different enough to make them sound different, either in the radiation or the linearity or the off-axis response and how well it's behaved. Those are the things that matter. It's not just the on-axis response only that you might only see from some outlets or in the past. And that's why we've gotten into this trick of thinking that measurements don't always tell the whole story. And generally it's because you just didn't have all the measurements. So I'm going to try to provide you with enough measurements here to tell a better story. Comparing the MoFi to the KEF, the MoFis have better low frequency extension, but the KEF is, at least from what I can tell, designed to be placed somewhat closer to a wall. There's a little bit of a roll off in the bass and then a flattening of it that makes it better suited for close wall placement where it doesn't sound too boomy. If you try to do that with the MoFi, if you try to put it really close to a wall, say within a foot, then you're going to find that it might be too boomy. Now, this is the case for every speaker ever. Placement near a wall is always going to change the bass output, but it seems like the KEF is designed in a way that makes it better suited for near wall placement. The Aura 2 has the deepest bass extension out of all of these speakers, but in my opinion, what it trades off is directivity in the high frequencies, so it narrows up really fast. I don't necessarily prefer that. And it also has a kick up around 13 kilohertz with a resonant peak that to me sounds a bit sharp or shrill on certain tracks. Otherwise, it's a fantastic speaker. The Wharfedale Linton 85, one of my top 5 speakers of all time, possibly going to get me bumped, possibly. Another fantastic speaker, very wide radiation through the mid-range, narrowing in the higher frequency. Doesn't quite dig as low as the Aura 2, but is about $1,000 or so cheaper than the Aura 2. The Aura 2 can be placed just a little bit closer to the wall than the Wharfedale, but it's not a huge difference, at least in my opinion. The Wharfedale has a little bit of a recess around 1 kilohertz, which is going to take some attack and maybe even make the speaker not quite sound as forward with certain tracks. Now, that's up to taste. I understand that manufacturers sometimes design these things to be reasonably linear, and then they go in and they change the response up a little bit in certain ways. Those are the differences audibly that I heard. Now, with that kind of light subjective work up front, let's get at the data, because honestly, I could make up anything, but I can just give you data and you can understand where I'm coming from. So let's do that. All the data that you're about to see is captured using my Clipple near-field scanner. It is a state-of-the-art robotic device that allows me to get anechoic data in a non-anechoic room. Again, for those of you who are new to this channel, this is a very expensive tool that allows me to understand what a speaker is doing anechoically, without reflection, without the room. I take the speaker out of the room, or the room out of the speaker. And then that allows us to better understand exactly what the speaker is doing. And then you can kind of extrapolate that into, oh, okay, it might make sense if this thing were to happen when I put it into a room, or I'm probably going to hear this when I put it into a room and aim it this way. Okay, let's go. We're going to start off with the MoFi frequency response at 15 degrees. Look how smooth this looks. I mean, it's reasonably linear. It's within about plus or minus 2 decibels. Now what happens when we bring in the KEF, about 10 degrees off axis? Well, the KEF is a little bit different. I mean, they're pretty dang close overall, but the noticeable portion is the bass. Now the bass on the KEF rolls off and then it kicks back up. This is called an extended shelf design, or extended bass shelf design. And the reason that they do it like this is because you can place the speaker a little bit closer to the wall without having a lot of boominess. Any speaker that you place close to a wall, it's going to increase the bass. And what's going to happen is on the lower end, that bass is going to start rising. As it rises, it can sound more boomy depending on the design. So what KEF has done is they've intentionally designed the speaker in a way that you can place it closer to the wall and it won't sound quite as boomy. So that would be a win if placement close to the wall is important to you. However, if placement off a wall is okay, then maybe the KEF doesn't make as much sense for you because it doesn't have as much bass output. What happens if you bring in the Wharfedale Aura 2? Well, the Wharfedale Aura 2, a lot lower frequency extension. I mean, compared to these other guys at 30 hertz, there's about 10 to 12 decibels. And at 40 hertz, there's as much as 4 to probably 6 or 7 decibels. The thing about the Wharfedale Aura 2, though, is that the high frequency bump right here to my ears sounded a bit shrill and sharp. And the thing is that as you find a track that maybe accentuates that a little bit more, it may be bothersome to you. Overall, it was okay, but it's something that is worth pointing out because it's a difference from the other two. I also want to briefly hide those other two and pay attention to this, what happens, okay? You've got this general mid-range region right through here. It's about 87.5 decibels, and you see this little dip in this mid-bass region? That's another sign that you can put this speaker a little bit close to the wall. Not as close as you can with the KEF, but with this speaker, you could place it a little bit close to the wall on the Aura and get a little bit more bass output. Now, if we bring in the Linton, compared to the Aura, well, sensitivity, a little bit lower for sure, but the overall linearity of the Linton is pretty reasonable. There is a little dip in this upper mid-range area right through there. The bass roll-off isn't quite as deep as the Aura 2, so that's something else to consider. Now I want to talk about what happens when you put the speaker in a room. So this is an estimated in-room response that we're about to talk about, and it gives us a very good idea of the overall tonal balance of the speaker in a room. Again, it's not going to be for every room, every placement, but if you're comparing apples to apples, this is a really good way to get an idea of the tonal characteristics of a speaker. We also need to keep in mind that as frequency increases, the radiation starts to narrow. So what happens in a room is you get a little bit more bass buildup, and on the high frequency, the top end starts to drop down. You do not want a flat in-room response. You do want a speaker that has a mildly falling high frequency response like we do here. So this is normal and this is good. Now what happens if we compare it to the KEF? Well, a similar thing, but interesting. So we've already talked about the bass, so I'm not going to talk about the bass for this comparison. But on the high frequency end, we notice that there is a little bit more deviation on the MoFi, where the KEF looks more linear through this region. Now the KEF right through about 1 to 1.5 kilohertz is maybe about a decibel lower. Might you hear that? Maybe. What could it sound like? Well, with the MoFi, it might sound like a little bit more attack, or with the KEF, it might sound like a little bit less attack, or a little bit more forwardness, or a little bit less forwardness, depending on how you relate things. Let's keep the KEF in here, and now we'll compare it to the Aura. Well, the Aura, mid-range area, roughly the same, a little bit more 1 through 2 kilohertz. So it's going to have a little bit more attack. Personally, I like that. In the past, speakers that I've tested that tend to have a little bit of a contour in that 1 to 2 to 1 to 3 kilohertz region, some call it the BBC dip. I personally don't like that. It sounds a little bit too soft to me. I like that aggressive sound. I wouldn't say that I would boost it, but I like a speaker that's more linear through that region. This particular Aura 2 speaker is a little bit boosted in that region, but I'm okay with it. And then if you go and look at the low end, of course, it's still doing better than the KEF that we talked about previously. Now let's drop the KEF and compare the Aura to the Wharfedale Linton 85. Okay. Now see the Linton 85? It's got this dip around 1 kilohertz. That's going to sound a little bit softer, maybe a little bit more recessed in the male vocal, female vocal region. Maybe make things sound like they're a little bit further out compared to the Aura 2. Now, if you were listening to these by themselves, would you notice the difference? Maybe. But back to back, will you notice the difference? Absolutely. I have no doubt that you would hear the difference. Now, which one are you going to prefer? That's up to you. Unfortunately, without having enough experience relating data to sound, then it's hard to say for sure. But what I hope is that through this video, maybe like I said earlier, you'll go and grab a couple speakers and then pick for yourself which one you think is going to be the better one. Now that we've talked about the estimated in-room response and the overall timbre that you can expect to hear, let's talk about sound radiation, because this is a big deal for me. Subjectively speaking, I like a speaker that's about plus or minus 60 degrees in sound radiation width. I want you to know that before we go any further. Some people prefer something a little bit narrow. An example where you might want something a little bit more narrow is if you have a very lively room and there's a lot of reflection and you just don't necessarily care for that. Maybe you've got a smaller room and the walls are really close to the speaker and you want a more focused, precise imaging kind of sound. You might then prefer a speaker that has a more narrow radiation. If you have a larger room and you like a larger sound and a larger sense of space and you're willing maybe to give up a little bit of image precision, then a wider radiating speaker might be for you. And there is certainly some in between in those two. Just because you have wide radiation doesn't mean that you can't have precise imaging. A lot of it comes down to your room, your aiming, and then just, the overall matching of speaker pairs, because that's another factor that I've recently started testing again, and it does matter. But with all that said, let's briefly flip through some of these. The horizontal radiation is one component. That's just how far out, how far wide the radiation of the sound characteristic is, and you generally want it to be pretty linear. With the MoFi 8, we see that it's about plus or minus 60 degrees because I'm going to this -6. So it's this lighter red color right in here, not dark red, this little bit middle red right there. About plus or minus 60. That hits dead on to what I love. I love this speaker sound, and it maintains its composure all the way up through about maybe 10 to 12 kilohertz, and then it starts to narrow a little bit, but not drastically. What about the KEF? Well, there's some similarity with the KEF. It's about plus or minus 50 or so, 60 in the mid-range area down through here, about 50 in the upper mid-range and treble region. But if I flip back, it actually looks like the MoFi Source Point 8 is a little bit wider, and I prefer the MoFi Source Point 8 for that reason. Now let's talk about the Aura 2. You see the big difference here. I'm gonna flip back to the MoFi 8. Take a second. Pay attention to the high frequency, okay? Aura 2. High frequency. Notice how this red is shrinking pretty drastically. What that means is the aura is pretty wide at about plus or minus 70 degrees right through the mid-range area. But in the high frequency, all of a sudden it just starts collapsing. Now that can create a problem subjectively, and this is just my subjective take. When speakers do that, imaging may not be quite what I want it to be. So if there's supposed to be a sound maybe far off on the soundstage at maybe 5 kilohertz, and then there's another sound that's stacked up on top of it. Let's say we got a vocalist and they're running from fundamental of 200 to 400 hertz, and then there's a snare that's like, I don't know, 800 hertz, and there's a trumpet at 2 kilohertz, and then we've got a cymbal at 10 kilohertz. With a speaker that has a uniform radiation, you're going to hear all those over here. But with this particular speaker, what you might hear is that everything is stacked up on top of each other, except for that cymbal, which may sound a little bit closer inward. That's because the sound radiation is wide up until about 7 kilohertz, as we see in this data right here. It's shutting in right there. And by the time you get to 10 kilohertz, it's about 30 to 40 degrees more narrow than those other sounds, that mid-range sound that you heard. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Now, whether or not it's going to be an issue for you, I can't tell you. I generally prefer a speaker to behave more consistently throughout. But sometimes that can be a little bit too much. There can be a little bit too much energy at the higher frequency. So that is going to come down to preference, at least in my experience. Take a look at the Linton 85. Go back to the Aura 2. The Aura 2 holds its composure through the mid-range, the crossover region better. And if I go to the 85 Linton, we can see that it shrinks down. So that radiation is reasonably wide. And then at around 2 kilohertz, it's kind of shrunken in, and then it shoots back out. It gets broad again. That can create a little bit of confusion if you happen to have, again, we're going to use that reference, sounds at maybe 1 kilohertz and then 2 kilohertz. They may not be in the same place. It's subjective, but it's just something to keep in mind. Let's talk about vertical. I really harped on that when I was talking about coaxial. So I'm going to give you an example of what I'm talking about. This is the vertical. So as you're standing up, the tweeter line would be 0 degrees right through here. And what happens if you go 50 degrees above the tweeter line? Well, it's reasonably close to the on-axis direct sound for the MoFi. And then for the KEF, again, it's pretty reasonably close. It's not too far off. But now we go to the Aura 2. You see how everything shrinks in? That red just shrinks in, just and closes right in. That means that the sound is much more directional. And if you're at 50 degrees or 30 degrees, or any of these other angles outside of this red color, it's going to sound drastically different. Now, this delineation here where these colors are really weird, that's a lobing effect. That's crossover or speaker cancellation in that crossover region. And that's just kind of funky. And generally you don't want that to happen, but you know, everything's a compromise. Higher frequencies, if you're standing up and you're in your kitchen doing some dishes, you probably aren't going to hear that cymbal snap too well at 10 kilohertz. Okay. What if we go to the Wharfedale Linton 85? Well, it's a little bit better than the Aura 2, but it's not a whole lot better. And it's definitely not better than the MoFi. Go back. So see, the Wharfedale has got some crossover cancellation here around 2 to 3 kilohertz. That means that placement with your ear is going to be non-trivial. If you have multiple rows, if you're walking around, things like that. If you're not in a central position most of the time when you're listening to the speaker, then it's not going to sound the same as you change seats. In terms of output capability, what I've done is, and this is probably something you'll want to pause and come back to later, I've given you a reference. From 70 decibels to 96 decibels, 26 dBs of dynamic range. How much compression is there for some of these speakers? Well, the KEF suffers the most compression. I'm not necessarily surprised, but there are some things that kind of intrigue me about it. The MoFi, it does really well at compression in this yellow. The Wharfedale Linton does pretty well, but it does have some higher frequency things going on that are kind of interesting. And then the Wharfedale Aura 2 also does pretty well. And it actually seems like the MoFi Source Point 8 and the Wharfedale Aura 2 both do the best job of maintaining their composure. In terms of distortion, though, the MoFi is a little bit over at the highest output, where I would personally prefer it to be. I want this negative 30 decibels, which is about 3% distortion. I want a speaker to be under that for me to feel like I'm not going to hear the distortion. And the MoFi does creep up above that a little bit. Whether or not this is going to be an issue to you, I'll leave that up to you. It really just comes down to your output needs and how far you're going to be sitting away. You know, if you're sitting 4 meters away from a speaker, then it needs to be able to get louder than it does if you're only sitting 2 meters away. If you tend to listen to music at 70 decibels versus 80 decibels, well, you're going to need a little bit more headroom. And that's where this information comes in handy. Overall, though, I would say that in terms of output capability, the Wharfedale Aura 2 pretty much eclipses these other speakers. The low end capability is much more to my liking. But then again, you may like some of these other aspects of these speakers and you don't necessarily need it to get as loud. Personally speaking, I don't know that there's a clear winner in any of these. So the problem is that, like everything, there's always trade-offs. You can trade off directivity. You can have more focused high frequency. You can have better bass output. You can have broader high frequency, broader mid-range. You can have more consistent radiation pattern if you're standing up and you're walking around your room. For example, let's say that your living room is also attached to your kitchen and you're listening to music. And maybe you still want to appreciate the music as good as it was from the living room while you're doing dishes. You're not really going to get that from most standard three-way speakers because you're going to be standing above where that tweeter line is. But with the KEF or the MoFi coaxials, you can achieve that. Then we talk about output capability. How loud can the speaker get? Well, these all get reasonably loud, but the Aura 2 seems to be the better of those. But do you need it to get that loud? And if you don't, do you prefer to have a broader high frequency? For example, the KEF or the MoFi? These are things that are going to be up to you to decide, but hopefully with all of this information, you can at least pick two and you can order those two and you can see what you want. Again, cheap plug, affiliate link is below, and I would personally appreciate that if you did that. With all of that said, I am out. I hope you, again, learned something, and I will talk to you all later. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. Take care. Peace.